In 1187, the Christian world trembled. Jerusalem, the holy city, the cross of the West, had fallen. But not by the hands of barbarians or infidels. It was conquered by a man admired even by his enemies, Saladin. While European kings marched for glory and penance, Saladin marched for a greater cause. On the Christian side, crusades with swords and blessings. On the Muslim side, a unified army under a symbol of faith and justice. It was more than a war. It was a crusade against a crusade. What few know is that Saladin didn't start as a warrior. He was a student, a man of prayer, and he became the Crusaders' worst nightmare, retaking Jerusalem without massacres, with mercy in a time of bloodshed. In this video we'll cross deserts, walls, and centuries to understand what truly happened. Who was Saladin? What drove the Third Crusade? And why does this clash still echo in modern discourses about East and West? You're about to relive one of the most sacred and most human wars in history. Take a deep breath. We're entering the burning dust where faith became a sword, and the desert became a field of judgment. Before becoming the terror of the Crusaders, Saladin was just a name among many in the Kurdish lineage. Born in Tikrit, in present-day Iraq, in 1137, his true name was Hidallah Yad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Contrary to popular belief, his childhood wasn't marked by swords or battles. It was marked by books, by teachers, by faith. In a world where the Crusades already echoed like distant thunder, young Saladin grew up surrounded by men of letters, not arms. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a respected official, but he preferred diplomacy to war. It was in this environment of wisdom and strategy that Saladin learned a vital lesson. True power doesn't come from the sword, but from self-mastery. But destiny rarely asks for permission. From scholar to strategist, the Middle East was simmering. The First Crusade had already conquered Jerusalem. Crusader states spread like thorns on the body of the Muslim world, and Nur ad-Din, the Emir of Aleppo and Damascus, needed men who would not just fight, but also think. Saladin reluctantly was called to military service, not out of ambition, but out of loyalty to his family. Instead of wielding weapons with a thirst for glory, Saladin saw war as a necessary evil, a burden, a responsibility. When he was sent to Egypt as his uncle Shirkuh's lieutenant, it was more as an administrator than a warrior. But it was there, amidst the Fatimid intrigues and the suspicious glances of the Shiites, that destiny began to shape him into a leader. Gradually, Saladin realized that Muslim unity was more fragile than the steel of Crusader swords, and that if no one united the fragments, Jerusalem would remain under foreign rule for generations. Faith wasn't enough. Leadership was needed. In 1171, after Shirkuh's death, Saladin rose to power in Egypt. He became vizier, but instead of being intoxicated by titles, he dissolved the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate, restoring Sunni orthodoxy, and with that he ideologically unified the two main Muslim centers of the time, Cairo and Damascus. Now, the reluctant warrior held what no one else had achieved: political power, religious backing, and popular support. But something was still missing, something that would transform him from a regional leader into a legendary figure: the return of Jerusalem to Islam. This desire wasn't motivated by vengeance or ambition, it was sacred. Jerusalem, for Saladin, was more than a symbol. It was a spiritual responsibility. Every step he took in the desert was driven by the memory of Al-Aqsa, by the humiliation Islam had suffered at the hands of the invaders, and by the conviction that justice would only make sense if accompanied by mercy. The boy from Tikrit had become the center of gravity of the entire Middle East. But what's most impressive is that, even with armies at his feet, Saladin still carried the heart of a devout man. He didn't see war as glory. He saw it as a cross, an invisible cross, weighing on his spirit every time blood was shed, even if it was necessary. And while the Crusaders slept confidently in their stone fortresses, a new type of enemy was rising in the desert sands, not a barbarian, but a warrior philosopher, a strategist who saw beyond the battlefield. a name that would soon echo even in the churches of Europe with both dread and respect, Saladin. While Saladin organized his domains in the south, to the north, the Christian fortresses echoed the pride of the First Crusade. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established in 1099, was the heart of the so-called Latin kingdoms, western enclaves driven like daggers into the lands of Islam. But behind their stone walls and Latin hymns, there were invisible cracks. The silent crusade was internal. Baldwin IV, the leper king, ruled with courage and visible weakness. The disease corroded his body, but not his cunning. Still, his kingdom was an unstable mosaic. Templar knights hungry for power, barons divided by their own interests, and Arab populations governed with an iron fist. The appearance of unity concealed the ferment of division. The Crusaders lived with one foot in war and the other in gold. The religious fervor that ignited the First Crusade was already giving way to political calculation, fragile alliances, and palace intrigues. War against the Muslims was expected, but not desired by all. After all, markets were full, tributes flowed, and caravans crossed deserts with Christian protection, as long as they paid the right price. Saladin's unifying vision, meanwhile, across the borders, Saladin did not attack immediately. He observed, he calculated. He knew it wasn't necessary to raise a sword to conquer a castle already cracked from within. And that's what he did. Without launching an army, he launched an idea, the unifying jihad. Instead of merely summoning soldiers, Saladin summoned a dream, an ideal, a new rebirth of Islam, not against the West, but against its own fragmentation. He preached in mosques, lectured in public squares, united enemy clans around a common foe, and little by little, the sultans who once warred among themselves began to march under his banner. In the halls of the Crusaders, Saladin's name grew like a shadow. His targeted attacks, swift, lethal, and almost always symbolic, revealed an enemy who fought not just for territory, but for meaning. He attacked strategic points, cut commercial routes, destroyed forgotten strongholds, as if drawing the siege before even besieging. But there was something the Crusaders still didn't understand. Saladin wasn't just seeking Jerusalem, he sought to demoralize the entire Crusader system, to undermine its confidence, and he did so with silence and patience. It was as if every year of peace was a year of invisible war, the looming storm. The internal division of the Latin kingdoms increased. Raymond of Tripoli, Gil of Lusignan, the master of the Templars, all disputed the kingdom's future, while the true enemy strengthened in silence. And the people, tired of tributes and endless wars, no longer saw the Crusaders as liberators, but as new feudal lords, who spoke a distant language and cared little for the Holy Land. The Silent Crusade was, therefore, a war of absence, of unmade decisions, of unsealed alliances, and in the growing void, Saladin planted the next harvest, that of Hattin. But this they still didn't know. As the bells of Jerusalem rang with less fervor, and the walls filled more with bureaucrats than with soldiers, a storm was gathering in the desert, and when it came, it would bring not just swords, it would bring justice, fire, and the memory of a profaned city. The countdown to the final clash had already begun, and the Latin kingdoms were deaf to the ticking of history. July 4th, 1187. The desert, like a divine furnace, stretched its thirsty mouth, and in it, nearly 20,000 Crusaders marched, led by Guy de Lusignan, the charismaless king, the commander without resolve. Ahead, the promise of liberating Tiberias. Behind, the echo of errors and arrogance. The trap was already set, and Saladin knew it. He had deliberately left the city vulnerable, as if to say, "Come." And they came, crossing the desert in midsummer, in heavy armor, and with insufficient water. Faith guided them, but faith also blinds. When they reached the foothills of the Horns of Hattin, two twin hills in the dry vastness, it was too late. The massacre at Hattin, Saladin's army surrounded them, like a swirling sandstorm. There was no escape, no water, no mercy. The smoke from bonfires, fueled by dry grass, made the air unbreathable. Archers were everywhere. Night fell with thirst, and the next day dawned with death. It was a battle without a battle, a sacred execution. The Crusaders fell one by one, their swords too heavy, their hearts too disoriented. Those who tried to resist saw their standards burn before their eyes. The Templars, Christ's elite, were mercilessly cut down, and when the sun reached its zenith, the sand was no longer golden, it was red. Saladin, however, was no butcher. When Guy de Lusignan was captured, he expected death. But the Sultan pardoned him. For honor, for show, for strategy. Reginald de Chatillon, the caravan butcher, the profaner of Mecca, he had a different fate. Saladin killed him with his own hands, saying, "He crossed the line." The standard of the true cross, which tradition held, had accompanied Christian armies since Golgotha, was captured. Like a broken symbol, it fell into Muslim hands, and with it, the pride of all Christendom fell. It was as if God had changed sides. The defeat at Hattin was more than military. It was spiritual, it was prophetic, and like all prophecy, it sent ripples across Europe. The Pope wept, kings grew uneasy. There, the Third Crusade was born, not out of ambition, but out of shame. Meanwhile, Saladin did not celebrate with ostentation. He walked among the dead with respect. He ordered the wounded to be treated. He freed humble prisoners, and he commanded prayers. Jerusalem was closer, but he knew the true victory is one that honors heaven. Hattin changed everything. It was the end of the Crusader legend of invincibility, and it was the dawn of a united Islam. For the first time in decades, the tribes, the imams, the sultans spoke one language, and that language said, "Al-Quds will be ours." The field of Hattin, now covered in silence and wind, still holds the footprints of massacre and mercy. There, the sand drank blood and glory, and there, the world understood that holy war was not a monopoly of the West. It could also be led by a man of prayer, wisdom, and sword. October 1187. The sun hung over the minarets, and faint bells tolled in Jerusalem. For the first time in almost a century, the city was about to change hands again. But this time, not with blood gushing down the temple stairs, as in 1099, when the Crusaders slaughtered Muslims and Jews indiscriminately. Now, the conqueror was named Saladin, and he didn't seek revenge, he sought justice. Around the walls, the Muslim army positioned itself with precision, but there was no haste, no war cries. There was waiting, a tense siege. Inside the city, the Christian defenders knew they were defeated. Balian of Ibelin, the Frankish knight who had become leader out of necessity, pleaded for clemency. He asked for negotiations. And Saladin, once again, surprised the world. Instead of demanding unconditional surrender or ordering a brutal invasion, Saladin proposed an agreement. Jerusalem would be handed over, and civilians could leave safely upon payment of a ransom. Those who could not pay would be freed out of mercy, not for coin. While many expected another carnage, Saladin showed that his sword was guided by principles. He knew that Jerusalem was more than a city. It was an eternal flame, and any drop of blood spilled there would burn for generations. A victory of honor and mercy. On October 2nd, exactly 88 years after the Crusaders took the city, the gates opened. Saladin's army entered not with roars, but with prayers. Crosses were removed with reverence, and minarets once again called to faith. Jews, previously expelled by the Christians, were invited to return. Ordinary Christians received safe passage. Temples were restored, not desecrated. It was a victory that did not shame the soul, but it was not a peace without pain. Thousands of Franks wept as they left the city. Women knelt at the gates. Children looked back as if leaving a piece of heaven. Saladin watched them in silence. It was the price of history, a price he chose to pay with mercy, not with steel. Meanwhile, Europe was seething. The loss of Jerusalem reignited religious fervor. It was inadmissible that a Saracen, even one as noble as Saladin, should govern the city of the Messiah. There the Third Crusade was born, with legendary kings, Richard the Lionheart, Frederick Barbarossa, Philip Augustus. The West would march again, and it would march with a thirst for redemption. But there in that golden October, Saladin had won more than a battle. He had won the narrative. He showed that a Muslim could conquer Jerusalem without becoming a barbarian, that Islam could not only fight, but govern with wisdom. The Jerusalem that rose after 1187 was not the same as during the Crusade of 1099. It was quieter, more tolerant, more stable, and in its alleys, mosques and churches, Saladin's footprints were etched, not in blood, but in honor. In the history of the East and West, few victories have been so complete, so clean, and so symbolic. Saladin not only retook the holy city, he elevated it, and he proved that a warrior's greatest power is to master himself in the moment of glory. The thunder didn't come from the sky, it came from the sea. In 1191, the shores of the Levant trembled with the sound of European galleys disembarking men and steel. Armor gleamed under the eastern sun, and at the head of those troops, among the French, Germans, and English, came a king who would become a legend, Richard the Lionheart. The fall of Jerusalem at Saladin's hands had been a seismic shock to the soul of Christendom. It was more than a lost city. It was the humiliation of an entire faith. The Pope called for war, and kings, once rivals, now united under the symbol of the cross to correct the error of the East. Frederick Barbarossa, the German emperor, never arrived. He drowned before seeing the battlefield. Philip Augustus of France would abandon the campaign. But Richard stayed, and between him and Saladin, not only a military rivalry was forged, but a duel of honor, intelligence, and reflection. Richard was brutal, impatient, impetuous, but courageous. Saladin was serene, calculating, but relentless. Both were masters of war, and both knew they faced an equal. The confrontation began in Acre, a strategic port city. Richard retook it with blood and sword. Hundreds of Muslim prisoners were executed before the city walls, an act that shocked even the Christians themselves. Saladin did not respond with a massacre, but with firmness. He would not yield Jerusalem out of fear, nor out of threat. Then came the clashes of Arsuf, Jaffa, and Ascalon. Memorable battles, where the bravery of the Templars, the attacks of Turkish archers, and the resistance of fortresses painted a burning east. Every move was calculated, every mistake, fatal. But Jerusalem, the jewel of the desert, never fell. Richard even sighted its walls. He wept before them, but he knew that taking it meant destruction, and he didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the 1099 Crusaders. He wouldn't become a barbarian to be king of ruins. Saladin in turn offered agreements, sacred corridors, freedom of pilgrimage. He was skilled not only with the blade, but with diplomacy. He knew that war was fought with battles, but won with time. Between clashes, the two respected each other. They exchanged gifts. Doctors, horses. There was more chivalry between them than among many allies. Because there they fought for more than just land. They fought for symbols, cross and crescent, west and east. Each step shaped the centuries to come. In 1192, exhausted, Richard made a truce with Saladin. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christians would have free access. It was an unstable peace, but a peace. And it was the end of the Third Crusade. Richard departed, without the crown of Jerusalem, but with the glory of having faced the greatest sultan of his era. Saladin remained, without having lost the city, but knowing that the war would never truly end. Because in those sands, armies fought for more than religion. They fought for narrative, and the world would still echo those steps centuries later. Two kings, two faiths, two swords, and a desert that never forgets. Saladin died on March 4, 1193. Not in battle, not with a sword in hand, but surrounded by doctors, prayers, and the memory of every city liberated, every word honored, and every enemy respected. And unlike the kings of Europe, Saladin left no overflowing coffers, no luxurious castles. When his guards opened the Sultan's coffers, they found just enough coins to pay for his funeral, because Saladin lived like a king, but died like a servant. His body was wrapped in simple linen, and above his coffin hung a black banner with the words, "All this the Sultan took with him." It was a reminder to the powerful no empire crosses the grave, but his name transcended. Saladin was not canonized, but he was revered. Not just by Muslims, but also by the Christians who fought him, because his greatest victory was not the conquest of Jerusalem, it was the conquest of respect. A virtuous adversary European chroniclers who called him an enemy also called him virtuous. Riccardo di San Germano wrote that he was more worthy than many Christian kings, and even Dante Alighieri, in writing his Divine Comedy, placed Saladin in limbo among the great sages, alongside Aristotle, Socrates, and Averroes, and not in hell, as was common for enemies of the faith. Saladin was greater than his time, because he fought not just for Allah, he fought for honor. He did not sack Jerusalem, he did not destroy churches, he did not massacre civilians. When the Crusaders were besieged and dying of thirst, Saladin sent water and doctors. When he captured nobles, he offered ransom, not humiliation. His sword was sharp, but his soul, even sharper. In Islamic culture, he became a symbol of justice. In European tradition, he became a reference for chivalry. Even in modern times, his name is invoked by political leaders, militants, and thinkers, each trying to claim the mantle of a man who united tribes, resisted empires, and won without corrupting himself. But perhaps Saladin's true legacy is this: he showed that it is possible to win a war without losing humanity. In the era of the Crusades, marked by massacres, deceit, and fanaticism, he was an exception, a man who balanced faith with reason, strength with mercy, sword with word. And that's why, even his enemies, who raised crosses against his banners, bowed their heads when his name was spoken. Saladin's tomb is in Damascus, in a modest room where flowers are still left today, and on the walls of time, his name remains inscribed, not in ink, but in respect. Because when even the enemy refuses to hate you, you have already won. The spears have fallen silent. The armor has rusted. The gates of the fortresses are now covered in sand and silence. But the Crusades, they still whisper. The desert guards its memories like one buries embers in ashes. They no longer burn the skin, but they warm the spirit of each generation that tries to understand why East and West still eye each other with distrust, defying time with the same questions, the same borders, the same names. Jerusalem is still disputed. The same walls that saw the blood of Crusader and Mamluk soldiers now see tourists, armed soldiers, kneeling faithful, and improvised bombs. Nothing has changed, and everything has changed. Because the war of Saladin and the Crusaders was not just for territory, it was for symbols, for narratives, for control of what represents the sacred. The holy city became a mirror of the world. Whoever controls Jerusalem believes they control something greater than stones. They believe they control heaven itself. And that's why, even today, the name of Saladin resurfaces as a legend, as a revered and feared shadow. In the squares of Syria, in the speeches of Iran, on the banners of Palestinian demonstrations, his image still cries out, "The West is still here, and it's not over yet." But the West also hears its own echoes. From the Crusader castles in the Holy Land to the museums of London and Paris, the memory of the Crusades is not one of absolute victory, but of permanent conflict. A reminder that every crusade is born from the dangerous mixture of faith and power. The Middle East never returned to being the same after that clash between the Knights of the Cross and the warriors of the Crescent. Tribes were dissolved, alliances forged, empires fragmented, and today, when we see the disputes between Shiites and Sunnis, Israel and Palestine, Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's impossible not to hear the footsteps of the Crusaders on the paths of the present. Because the war of the past shaped the current map, a cycle of memory and conflict. But perhaps the greatest echo of the war lies in the words, in school books, in the sermons of mosques and churches, in the inflamed speeches of leaders who evoke holy war as if time had frozen. After all, what war ends when no one is willing to forget? Saladin and the Crusaders may be gone, but their stories continue to be used as inspiration or threat. And in this new millennium, where satellites fly over skies that once saw archers, and drones patrol the valleys where Templars once rode, battles are still fought for ancient ideas. The question that echoes then is, will we have the courage to break the cycle, or will we continue to live in the shadow of rusted swords, feeding myths that keep the scars open? History observes us, and while the desert whispers the names of Saladin, Richard, Jerusalem, Hatton and Crusades, it is up to us to decide whether we will listen or repeat. Because some wars don't need soldiers to continue being fought, all it takes is a poorly healed memory, an inherited hatred, a distorted symbol, and when that happens, the past never ends. Continue your journey with sand and blood. If this story touched you, it's because the sands of the past still blow into the present, and if you feel that the world is on the verge of repeating its mistakes, then join us. Subscribe to Sand and Blood, the channel that unearths myths, exposes tensions, and reveals the untold side of wars, religions and empires in the Middle East. From Saladin to the Sunnis, from Jerusalem to Iran, here each chapter carries the weight of 1,000 years. Leave your comment. Do you think the war truly ended, or did it just change its name? Share this video with those who need to understand that today's world was shaped by battles no one dares to forget.